I'm going to talk a little bit about the originations of May Day and what May Day means and celebrates, and how that connects to our work as people who are trying to really build a new type of union and a new type of movement. We can't see the slides. Thank you, Winter. Um, and um, and really speak to what we were just talking about like really getting people involved and making people take those steps so that we can address what can be considered in many ways sometimes a selfish need, but is actually a whole of system and overarching need that all of us have. And how do we actually help take people on that journey? Um, so I will ask Winter to go to the next slide. So I don't know how many folks on this call know this, but in case you don't, I probably should have asked a question before. May Day actually celebrates the fight for an 8-hour workday. That is actually the day that we are commemorating. And it falls on the 1st of May, which is also called International Workers of the World Day. And for those of you who I don't know, I probably should have introed myself. My name is Umi. I am the Debt Collective's organizing director, but I actually spent the majority of my work over the past decade working in traditional labor unions. So I can spend literally all day, every day talking to you about labor unions. And so one of my favorite things to talk about is the originations of May Day, because I think it's such a beautiful way for us to be able to think about the power of our collective action and our solidarity, but also the risks and challenges with us being able to build that together. So, um, the fight for an 8-hour workday actually comes from the great city of Chicago. So I don't know if anyone from this call is from Chicago, but that's really where the machinations of this movement started. And so at the time, around the 18, let's say late 1800s, people were working an indefinite amount of hours in the day. And I know that that's still true to this day, where people will work multiple jobs. But in that time, there was no legal regulation around how many hours a person could work, and then when you would be considered in overtime. So literally, your boss could just tell you to work at any time. And we're talking about like peak labor intensive work. And so people from all across the world, but especially in the city of Chicago, because of the history of militancy and movement there, started coming together, and because the union movement was already fairly active there, as well as the socialist movement and the communist movements and anarchist movements as well. They started coming together and saying, what can we do to address this challenge that we're facing around the exploitation of labor and the amount of hours that we have to come to work and the experience that we're all having to face as part of this. And so, as part of that conversation, they came to an idea of the 8-hour day. So that would be 8 hours of work, 8 hours for rest, and then 8 hours for whatever you want. So that's why it's 8, 8, and 8. And that will add up to 24 hours a day, which is also why if you work more than 8 hours a day, you should consider if you should be, if you don't have to, because as the story continues, it gets crazy. So they decided to fight for an 8-hour day. I also want to provide the caveat that not everyone agreed with this. It was actually the idea that received the majority support, but there were definitely people who thought that this wasn't enough, that what we needed to do was change work entirely, and that the horizon should be set even farther, that we actually needed to get rid of all of the different types of structures of work, and that regardless of how many hours a day you were working, the fact that you worked hours a day meant that you were complicit in capital. So you needed to be able to reform that. But the idea that got the most traction with the largest amount of people was the 8-hour day. And so people started taking action around it, especially as members of different unions started like negotiating contracts and going on strike. They started making a demand for it within local contracts and things like that to be able to achieve that. But then there started being more of a conversation around the whole of the city and the whole around of the state about this campaign, about being able to actually all fight together for an 8-hour day, because it became obvious that doing it one by one in such a small sort of way just wasn't going to be able to change everything. Like if you're trying to change literally the idea of work, you need everyone to be involved in the fight. So what that led to was an event that was organized by many different, all of the different people that were in the city of Chicago and within the area who were involved in activism around the conditions of work, which became the Haymarket Massacre. So I'm going to ask Winter to go to the next slide. So A number of folks. So I think the estimate is around 250,000 workers in Chicago got involved directly in this campaign. And it included like all of the trade unions, the socialist parties, local knights of labor, anarchists, like everyone that you could think of that was interested in reforming this. And they called the first thing that we always call whenever you're trying to build a movement, a mass meeting. And they asked people to come together, and they called it a call to arms. They said it was time to change things, and it was time to take action to be able to change things. And they called that mass meeting for May 1st, 1886, which is where May Day comes from. And so folks came together. It was, I'm gonna get these numbers right. On May 1st, there were more than 300,000 workers across 13,000 businesses across the entire state, the entire country at that point, because they had worked to organize across everywhere, to actually take place in May Day celebrations. And in Chicago, in and of itself, they when 40,000 workers went on strike, and they kept being on strike. So they did what's considered like a one day more strategy, where you just stay on a picket line and you wait until things change, which means you have to have a lot of commitment to be able to get people to be willing to stand up for that. And what happens in that sort of strategy, as we can all imagine, is that local officials and police get involved. So unfortunately, it did become a massacre, not the same day, not on May 1st, but within a number of days. The protests kept growing. More and more folks walked off the jobs. We started with 40,000 people on May 1st, and then by May 3rd, there were almost 100,000 people that were out on the street, and saying that things need to change. And that is when violence started breaking out. And it was between police and strikers, and Pinkerton agents specifically. Pinkerton, notoriously really amazing for busting unions and working really hard to stop the spread of any sort of idea of socialism within the country. They were obviously there to try and stop what was happening, and they managed to. But unfortunately, the way they managed to was that there was an explosion, and no one knows how the explosion was started, and it led to further gunfire. And so, in the end, there was a picket line and a lockout that lasted for almost about 6 months. And in that process, at least 200 protesters went to jail. Thousands of people were out on the streets and were harmed in some sort of way, but hundreds of people went to jail, and unfortunately, people died as well, all in this call for an 8-hour workday. Um, and it just kept escalating from there. Like within that period of time, there were further strikes and protests. There was more police violence. And so in the end of it all, I think at least 8 civilians were killed. And then there were a number of protesters, the 8 key protesters that had organized and worked together to build this movement were thrown into jail. And the people who were on their jury were actually business leaders and business officials. So they got the harshest penalty that they could get. And then that actually led to further strikes and protests across the country, which finally culminated in an actual win and an actual recognition of the need for workers to have 8 hours of work, and what we now consider a celebration, May Day. But it actually has its roots in conflict and tension and in people standing up and standing together across many different types of perspectives and types of work. We're talking about everyone from manufacturers to cleaners, men and women, just trying to come together to be able to change things. And so, if Winter could go to the next slide, um, I think that the Haymarket Massacre and most of the things that the labor movement teaches us is about the fact that nothing will happen unless we actually take action for it. Like the problems that exist within our society are almost obvious. It might feel obvious that no one should have to work 16 hours a day, but that's not something that was considered obvious at the time. And in order for that to change, it literally took hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets, as well as people risking their lives and losing their lives for us to be able to enjoy 8 hours of work, which is why if you have a job where you can only work 8 hours, you should genuinely consider it. And every aspect of the wins that the labor movement has had is actually the wins of working people. And none of them have been simple. All of them come from that narrative of struggle, of collective action, and all of these little pictures, I love this little thing. All of these little pictures have a story like that. They have an origination in a very complicated campaign that involved many different people coming together, trying to change things that would really address a large system of problems, having a lot of challenges along the way of being able to collaborate, being able to make people feel like the risks are worth it, and then also starting small and then going big. With Chicago, we saw that originally on day one, it was only 40,000 people. It wasn't until day three that it was 100,000 people. And it wasn't until 6 months in that we won. So there's always going to be that sort of arc of struggle, of challenge, and of being able to accomplish it through solidarity and through collective action and struggle. So, May Day is my favorite holiday, and it is for that reason. It is because there is just so much richness and so much potential in our global activism and in our local activism if we build strength and solidarity together. And so, if we go to the next slide, we can see some of my favorite things, which are pictures of May Day. Because although May Day originates from the US, it has become a global day with workers calling for change within their own communities and countries, but also globally. So that and the calls are not just about work. The call for 8 hours of work means 8 hours of rest and 8 hours of play. The labor movement has always been a part of struggles outside of traditional workplace, which sometimes the labor movement forgets and sometimes we forget, but it is always that intersectional struggle around migrant rights, women's rights, justice, against the police, because they're the ones shooting people on picket lines, and against all of the struggles that we're all facing. So I think these are pictures of uh, Thailand and India, maybe, no, Thailand and Germany, maybe. And if we go to the next one, um, we will see Korea and India or Bangladesh. So it's truly a day when you will see people on the streets, and in a pandemic, it's not obviously the same, but it is something where it is a moment where everyone is thinking about what is it that we can struggle for together and what is it that we can win together across different types of work, across different types of struggle. There's so much commonality there. Um, and then there's also so much power on the other side. So if Winter, you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, one of the things that a lot of people tell me about whenever I talk about May Day, as I love to, is that they don't really realize that it started in the US because we don't really talk about it in the US. And that's a concentrated thing that happens. The idea of May Day in the US has really been diluted because of concerns around the idea of what collective power could mean. Those who are against collective power for people know the impact and the potential of us actually thinking about these things are. I recently lived in Australia, and one of the first things that a conservative government tried to do was change the date of May Day and actually move it so that it was in September, because then people wouldn't think about how it's about this global struggle with all workers coming together and about the power of collective action. Sometimes people think May Day is just about the month of May or it's just about something else. It is actually truly about the power we have and the cost that it will take for us to be able to achieve together, but everything we can achieve together. Because I don't know if you remember that like incredible list of things, but we've done a lot. We can do so much more. And that leads us to kind of the reasons why, as we're building a union of debtors and we're building all of this together, it's fun to think about May Day, and it's important for us to remember the originations of all of this work, but also what the intersections are. So on the next slide, um, there's just a picture, there's nothing there. But there's definitely a lot that we can not only take from, in terms of like the importance of May Day and the strategies that worked and the tactics of solidarity and bringing people together and the ways that people dealt with challenges and conflicts and stood together even in tough times, and how people, to speak to what we were talking about before, people were struggling on their individual work because they were working 16 hours a day, and those conversations had to get people to think about not only what they were struggling with every day at work, but getting them to stand on a picket line for 6 months. So actually being able to build that sense of community, solidarity, and strength to get people to stand strong together to actually be able to win together. And the work of debtor organizing is so tied to the work of labor organizing because it is truly about money, right? Like the more that we lose rights and conditions at work, the more that people are taking on debt, there's a huge gap that's being created, and it allows that we know that the power of labor, that or what people consider the power of labor, is the ability for you to withhold something that's important to someone else. So the main power that people think of with a labor union is being able to go on strike. And that is withholding your labor. And if you can collectively do that, that's a way to break your target. But a debtors union has that same power, but we're actually trying to build power with something that people don't realize can be an asset, and don't realize that it's actually the secondary aspect of that gap in labor. So as long as wages are dropping, as long as we have to take on debt to go to school, as long as we have to take on debt to pay our bills because we're not getting healthcare through work, we're going to need a movement. We're going to need debtors unions to be able to collectivize and organize around these issues. And much like the labor movement and all of the other movements before us that have been organizing in this space and organizing to build a better world, we're going to have to build coalition, build strength, build community and solidarity, um, and then take action to really win. But what we've seen through all of these movements is that the enemies are strong and they have a lot of power, but we have so much more power when we stand together. And we have so much opportunity to really transform this world by being united in that solidarity.